I pretended to turn up my hearing aid when they whispered, but the truth was I heard every single word they said to that lawyer about putting me away. They thought my hearing was going, thought I was becoming a burden, thought I was too old to understand what was happening around me. But what they didn't know was that I had been listening all along, and what I heard would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Mika Chen, and at 73 years old, I had spent the last 5 years living in my daughter-in-law's house in Spokane, Washington, watching my world shrink smaller and smaller with each passing day. I wasn't supposed to be there permanently. When my husband Frank died and I sold our little house on the other side of town, the plan was simple. Stay with David and Jennifer for a few months while I figured out my next steps. Maybe find a nice senior community, something manageable and bright where I could start fresh. Those few months had turned into 5 years of existing in the margins of their life. 5 years of being the old woman in the back bedroom who moved quietly through their routines like a ghost they'd grown accustomed to but never quite welcomed. 5 years of hearing myself referred to in the third person even when I was sitting right there in the room. "Mika's getting more confused lately," Jennifer would say to David while I folded their laundry. "Did you see how she put the milk in the pantry yesterday?" They'd share these concerned looks over my head, as if I were a child who couldn't understand adult conversations. I had been a legal secretary for 42 years before I retired. I had organized files, transcribed depositions, managed court schedules, and handled confidential documents that could make or break cases. My mind was sharp as a blade, my attention to detail impeccable, and my ability to hear exactly what people were saying, even when they thought they were being subtle, had served me well in that profession. But now, in this house, I had somehow become the doddering grandmother whose faculties were failing, whose presence was more obligation than choice. The hearing aid had been Jennifer's idea. She'd insisted on taking me to the audiologist after claiming I'd been asking people to repeat themselves too often. The truth was, I asked them to repeat things because they mumbled, because they spoke to me while looking at their phones, because they assumed I wasn't worth the effort of clear communication. But the audiologist ran his tests and pronounced that yes, I had some age-related hearing loss, nothing severe, but enough to warrant a small device tucked behind my ear. Jennifer had been triumphant about the diagnosis, as if it confirmed everything she'd suspected about my declining capabilities. She'd announced it to David that evening like she'd solved a mystery. I knew something was off. The doctor says it's been getting worse gradually, which explains so much. They'd both nodded, as if my slight hearing loss was evidence of some larger deterioration, some reason to speak around me instead of to me. What they didn't understand was that the hearing aid actually made me hear better than I had in years. Every whispered conversation, every muttered complaint, every hushed discussion about my future that they thought I couldn't follow became crystal clear. I heard Jennifer on the phone with her sister, describing me as getting harder to manage. I heard David tell his coworker that having me in the house was putting strain on the marriage. I heard my own granddaughter Emma tell her friend that Grandma Mika is kind of weird now and smells like old people. I heard it all, but I said nothing. I had learned that correcting them only made things worse, only gave them more ammunition for their narrative that I was becoming difficult and argumentative. So I played the part they'd written for me. I smiled when they spoke loudly and slowly. I nodded when they explained simple things to me as if I'd never encountered them before. I let them believe that I was fading, when in reality I was listening more carefully than I ever had in my life. The house itself felt like a carefully orchestrated performance of family harmony. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Jennifer had redecorated since I'd moved in, choosing colors and furniture that made everything look like a magazine spread but felt nothing like a home. The kitchen was all white marble and stainless steel, beautiful to look at but cold to the touch. My bedroom was the smallest in the house, wedged between the laundry room and the garage, with a window that looked out onto the neighbor's fence. Jennifer had called it cozy when she'd first shown it to me, but cozy was just a polite word for cramped. I kept my belongings to a minimum because there was no space for anything that belonged to the life I'd lived before. My wedding china stayed in boxes in the garage. The photographs from my marriage, my career, the trips Frank and I had taken were limited to a small album on my nightstand. The books I'd collected over decades were donated because there was no room for bookshelves in my cozy space. I existed in that house like a visitor who'd overstayed her welcome, careful not to take up too much room, careful not to leave traces of myself in the common areas. Meals were the worst part of each day. Jennifer cooked elaborate dinners that she photographed for social media, meals that required specific dietary restrictions I'd never had, and preferences I'd never expressed. She'd decided I couldn't handle spicy food, couldn't digest dairy properly, needed everything cut into smaller pieces for easier chewing. When I tried to cook for myself, she'd hover in the kitchen, watching my every move as if I might burn the house down or poison myself with my own dinner. "Mika, are you sure you should be using that knife?" she'd ask when I tried to slice vegetables. "Maybe I should help you with that." She'd take the knife from my hands before I could answer, finishing the task herself while explaining how I needed to be more careful, how accidents happened so easily at my age. I'd stand there, hands empty, watching her take control of even the simplest tasks I'd been doing independently for 73 years. David was gentler but no less patronizing. He'd pat my shoulder when he passed my chair, ask how I was feeling in the tone people use with hospital patients. He'd offer to drive me places I hadn't asked to go, suggest activities he thought might be appropriate for someone my age. "There's a senior center downtown, Mom. They have bingo on Thursdays and craft time on Tuesdays. Jennifer thinks you might enjoy meeting people your own age." He meant well, but his kindness felt like pity, and his suggestions felt like ways to get me out of the house for a few hours. The grandchildren, Emma and Marcus, had grown distant since I'd moved in. They'd been 7 and 9 when I first arrived, still young enough to crawl into my lap for stories, still interested in hearing about the old days or learning to play cards. But now Emma was 12 and Marcus was 14, and I'd become part of the furniture they navigated around without much thought. They'd grunt hello when they passed me in the hallway, answer my questions with single words, disappear into their rooms when I tried to start conversations. I understood that teenagers weren't naturally drawn to spending time with grandparents, but the distance felt deliberate, encouraged. I'd catch Jennifer giving them subtle signals when I'd try to engage them, little shakes of her head or meaningful looks that said, "Just be polite and move along." They'd learned to see me the way their parents did, as someone to be managed rather than enjoyed, someone whose presence required patience rather than genuine interest. The isolation was the cruelest part. I'd spent my working years surrounded by people, handling important responsibilities, being consulted and valued for my experience and judgment. In this house, I was consulted about nothing. They made decisions about my medical care without asking my opinion. They scheduled my appointments without checking if the times worked for me. They discussed my future in whispered conversations they thought I couldn't hear, as if I had no say in what happened to my own life. I tried to maintain some independence by taking walks around the neighborhood, but even that became another source of concern. Jennifer worried that I might get lost, might fall, might not remember my way home. She'd suggested I carry a phone with GPS tracking, had even looked into medical alert devices I could wear around my neck. "Just in case," she'd say, but I knew what she really meant. Just in case I proved her right about my declining capabilities. The neighborhood itself was pleasant enough, full of young families with children and well-maintained lawns, but I was the only person my age on the entire street. I'd wave to neighbors when I passed, but they'd nod politely and hurry along, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of being drawn into conversation with the old woman who lived with the Chen family. I wasn't part of their community. I was just someone who happened to exist in their space. At night, when the house finally quieted down, I'd lie in my narrow bed and listen to the sounds of life continuing around me. Jennifer watching her shows in the living room, David working late in his home office, the children messaging friends or playing games on their devices. I was surrounded by family but had never felt more alone. I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder how I'd become so invisible in my own life, how I'd allowed myself to shrink into this small, careful existence where my primary goal was simply not to be a burden. The worst part was that I'd started to believe their version of me. When you hear yourself described as confused, declining, difficult often enough, you begin to question your own perceptions. Maybe I was asking too many questions. Maybe I was being too stubborn about wanting to do things myself. Maybe the independence I'd fought so hard to maintain was just selfishness disguised as dignity. Maybe they were right to worry, right to take control, right to make decisions for my own good. But then came the morning that changed everything. I was sitting in the kitchen, slowly eating the bland oatmeal Jennifer had prepared for me, when I heard David on the phone in the next room. His voice was low, careful, but my hearing aid picked up every word with perfect clarity. He was talking to someone about the situation with my mother, about options for long-term care, about what we need to do to protect everyone involved. I kept eating my oatmeal, kept my expression neutral, but my heart started racing as I realized what I was hearing. David wasn't just having a casual conversation about my future. This was business. This was planning. This was the kind of careful, legal language I'd heard countless times during my years working in law offices. He was talking to an attorney, and they were discussing me like I was a problem that needed to be solved, rather than a person who deserved to be part of the conversation about her own life. That phone call was the beginning of everything that followed. The moment I realized that playing along with their narrative of my decline had been the biggest mistake of my life. They weren't taking care of me out of love or concern. They were managing me, controlling me, positioning themselves to make decisions that would benefit them rather than me. And they thought I was too far gone to understand what was happening. But I understood everything. I heard everything. And for the first time in 5 years, I started planning my own next move. The opportunity came disguised as Jennifer's weekly book club meeting. Every Tuesday evening, she hosted 6 women in our living room, and I was expected to disappear into my bedroom by 7 o'clock, as if my presence might somehow contaminate their discussion of whatever romance novel they'd chosen that month. Jennifer had made it clear from the beginning that these gatherings were not appropriate for me, that the women preferred privacy for their more mature conversations, which I'd learned meant gossip about their neighbors and complaints about their husbands. That particular Tuesday in March, I followed my usual routine. I heated up leftover soup for dinner, washed my bowl quietly so as not to disturb the pre-meeting preparations, and retreated to my room with a magazine I'd already read 3 times. But as I settled into the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, I realized I'd forgotten to take my evening medications from the kitchen counter. The pills were important, prescriptions for blood pressure and arthritis, that couldn't be skipped, but I knew Jennifer would be irritated if I emerged from my room once her guests had arrived. I waited until I heard the women's voices growing louder, their laughter filling the space, and then I crept out of my bedroom toward the kitchen. The hallway was dark, and I moved carefully, knowing that any sound would draw attention to my unwelcome presence. As I reached for my pill container on the counter, I heard my name mentioned in the living room, spoken in the hushed tone people use when discussing someone they assume can't hear them. "Mika's been getting worse lately," Jennifer was saying to her friend Sandra. "David and I are really starting to worry about her safety. Just yesterday I found her trying to use the stove with a dish towel draped over the burner. She could have burned the house down." I froze with my hand still reaching for the pills. I had never draped a dish towel over any burner. I had never done anything remotely dangerous in their kitchen. Jennifer was lying, creating incidents that had never happened, building a case against me in casual conversation with her friends. "Oh no, that's exactly what happened with my mother-in-law before we had to move her," Sandra replied. "These little accidents start adding up, and then one day something really serious happens. You're smart to be thinking ahead." Another voice chimed in, someone I didn't recognize. "My sister went through this with her husband's father." The denial phase is the hardest part. They think they're still capable of everything they used to do, but their judgment is completely gone. He kept insisting he could drive until the day he backed into a neighbor's mailbox. "David's been researching facilities," Jennifer continued, and I felt my blood turn cold. "We're looking at places that specialize in memory care, somewhere she'd be safe and properly supervised." It's heartbreaking, but we have to think about what's best for everyone, including the children. Emma's been having nightmares because she's worried about Mika wandering around the house at night. This was another complete fabrication. Emma hadn't spoken to me in weeks, and I certainly hadn't been wandering around their house at night. I went to bed at 9:30 every evening and stayed in my room until morning. But Jennifer was painting a picture of me as a dangerous, confused old woman who posed a threat to her family's safety and peace of mind. "The hardest part is getting them to agree to the move," Sandra said knowingly. "My mother fought us tooth and nail. We finally had to get a lawyer involved to help with the guardianship paperwork. It sounds harsh, but sometimes you have to save people from themselves. Guardianship. The word hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to move me into a facility, they were planning to take away my legal right to make my own decisions. They were going to have me declared incompetent, so they could control every aspect of my life, from where I lived, to how I spent my money, to what medical treatments I received. I stood in that dark kitchen, pills forgotten, listening to my daughter-in-law describe me to her friends as a woman who no longer had the capacity to care for herself. She spoke with such conviction, such detailed examples of incidents that had never occurred, that for a moment I wondered if I was losing my mind. Had I really tried to cook with a dish towel over the burner? Was I wandering the house at night without remembering? Was my perception of reality so distorted that I couldn't trust my own memories? But then I heard Jennifer laugh, the satisfied sound she made when she'd successfully convinced someone of something important to her. The lawyer David talked to says we should start documenting everything now. Every little incident, every sign of confusion, every time she does something that shows she's not thinking clearly. He says judges like to see a pattern of declining behavior over time. Smart, another voice agreed. You want to build a solid case before you file the paperwork. My brother-in-law had to go to court 3 times because they didn't have enough evidence the first 2 times. I realized with perfect clarity that Jennifer wasn't confused about my mental state. She knew exactly how sharp and aware I still was, and that's why she was creating false evidence against me. A truly confused person wouldn't pose a threat to her plans. A confused person wouldn't question the decisions being made on their behalf, wouldn't resist being moved into a facility, wouldn't fight for their independence. But a clear-minded person who simply happened to be old and financially vulnerable, a person who might object to being controlled and manipulated, that person needed to be discredited in advance. The financial planning aspect is crucial too, Jennifer continued. David's been meeting with our accountant to make sure we understand all the implications. Apparently there are ways to structure things so that her assets can be preserved for the family while still qualifying her for government assistance with the facility costs. My hands started shaking as the full scope of their plan became clear. This wasn't about my safety or well-being. This was about money. They wanted to gain control of my finances, while making me financially dependent on programs for people who had no other resources. They were planning to steal my independence and my assets while making it look like they were sacrificing themselves to care for an aging relative. I had worked for over 4 decades, saved diligently, invested carefully. Frank and I had paid off our house, built a substantial retirement account, purchased life insurance that had left me comfortable when he died. I wasn't wealthy, but I had enough money to live independently for the rest of my life, enough to choose where and how I wanted to spend my remaining years. And David and Jennifer were planning to take all of that away from me, while convincing everyone, including possibly a judge, that they were doing it for my own good. The book club conversation moved on to other topics, but I couldn't focus on their words anymore. I stood in that kitchen for another 20 minutes, pills still forgotten, processing what I'd learned and trying to understand what it meant for my immediate future. They were building a case against me, documenting incidents that didn't exist, consulting lawyers and accountants about the best way to take control of my life and assets. They weren't just planning to move me out of their house, they were planning to make it impossible for me to live anywhere else except under their supervision. When I finally returned to my bedroom, I didn't turn on the light. I sat on the edge of my bed in the darkness and forced myself to think clearly about my situation. For 5 years, I had allowed them to diminish me, to make me smaller and quieter and more dependent than I actually was. I had gone along with their narrative about my declining capabilities, because it seemed easier than fighting them, because I thought keeping peace in their house was more important than asserting my own dignity and autonomy. But keeping peace had been a trap. Every time I deferred to Jennifer's judgment about my health, every time I'd let David make decisions about my schedule and activities, every time I'd accepted their characterization of me as someone who needed management rather than respect, I had given them more ammunition to use against me. My compliance had been interpreted as evidence of my incompetence. My desire to avoid conflict had been twisted into proof that I was no longer capable of standing up for myself. I thought about the lawyer Sandra had mentioned, the one who had helped her family gain guardianship over her mother-in-law. I thought about judges who wanted to see patterns of declining behavior. I thought about the way Jennifer had laughed when she described documenting my confusion, as if she enjoyed the process of building a case against me. I thought about my granddaughter supposedly having nightmares about me, another lie designed to make me seem like a burden and a threat to innocent children. The anger that rose in me was unlike anything I'd felt in years. It wasn't the frustrated irritation of someone being patronized or dismissed. It was the clear, focused rage of someone who had finally understood the true nature of the threat they were facing. They weren't just disrespecting me or taking me for granted. They were actively working to destroy my autonomy and steal my resources while making it look like an act of compassion. But anger alone wouldn't save me. I needed a plan, and I needed to act before they could file whatever legal paperwork they were preparing. I needed to prove to myself and to anyone who might matter that I was still completely capable of making my own decisions and managing my own life. I needed to do something that would demonstrate my competence so clearly that no lawyer or judge could question my mental capacity. The next morning, I waited until David left for work and Jennifer drove the children to school. Then I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out the small suitcase I'd brought with me 5 years earlier, the one that had been shoved behind winter coats and forgotten storage boxes. I packed carefully, taking only what I truly needed and what couldn't be easily replaced. My important documents were already in a folder in my dresser drawer, documents Jennifer had never thought to look for because she assumed I was too confused to keep track of such things. I called a taxi from the landline in the kitchen, giving them an address I'd memorized but never visited. Then I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a note that I hoped would buy me some time before they realized what I'd done. The note was brief and deliberately vague. Gone to visit an old friend for a few days. Don't worry about me. I'll call when I'm settled. I signed it with my name and left it propped against the coffee maker where Jennifer would find it when she returned from her morning errands. When the taxi arrived, I met the driver at the end of the driveway, suitcase in hand, heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration I hadn't felt since I was young. I was 73 years old, and I was running away from home for the first time in my life. I was leaving behind the illusion of safety and security to venture into uncertainty. But the uncertainty I was choosing felt infinitely preferable to the trap I was escaping. The driver was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who didn't ask questions about why an elderly woman with a suitcase wanted to go to a downtown office building on a Wednesday morning. He helped me with my luggage, made gentle conversation about the weather, and wished me well when he dropped me off at my destination. I stood on the sidewalk watching his car disappear into traffic, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The building in front of me housed several law offices, including the one I'd found in an online directory the night before. I had never contacted them, never made an appointment, never even spoken to anyone there. But I had spent 42 years working in similar offices, and I knew that most attorneys would make time to see a potential client, especially one who walked in with the kind of story I was prepared to tell. The receptionist was a young woman with purple-streaked hair and multiple ear piercings, who looked up from her computer screen with genuine interest when I approached her desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, and there was nothing condescending in her tone. Nothing that suggested she saw me as someone who might be confused about where she was or what she wanted. "I need to speak with an attorney about protecting my assets and my legal rights," I said clearly. "I believe someone is planning to file for guardianship over me, and I want to make sure they can't succeed." The young woman's eyebrows rose, and she glanced at her appointment book. "Let me see if Mr. Harrison has any time this morning. This sounds like something that shouldn't wait." Within 20 minutes, I was sitting across from attorney Robert Harrison, a man about my son's age with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, explaining my situation in the kind of clear, detailed language I'd learned during my decades in legal offices. I told him about the conversations I'd overheard, the false incidents Jennifer had described to her friends, the financial planning meetings David had been attending. I told him about my work history, my education, my current mental and physical health, and my desire to make my own decisions about my future. Mr. Harrison listened carefully, taking notes and asking relevant questions. He didn't treat me like a confused elderly woman who might be imagining things. He treated me like a client with a legitimate legal problem who needed professional assistance to resolve it. When I finished my story, he leaned back in his chair and gave me the kind of direct assessment I'd been craving for years. "Mrs. Chen," he said. Based on our conversation this morning, you are clearly competent to make your own legal and financial decisions. If someone is planning to file for guardianship over you, we need to take immediate steps to protect your rights and document your mental capacity. The fact that you recognized the threat and took action to address it actually works strongly in your favor. For the first time in months, I felt tears of relief rather than frustration. Someone in authority was taking me seriously, treating me like an adult who deserved respect and protection under the law. Someone was confirming what I'd known all along but had begun to doubt about my own capabilities and mental clarity. What do I need to do? I asked. First, we're going to arrange for you to undergo a comprehensive mental competency evaluation by a qualified psychologist. I want documentation from a neutral professional that proves you have full capacity to manage your own affairs. Second, we're going to review all your financial accounts and assets to make sure no one has gained unauthorized access. Third, we're going to draft some protective legal documents that will make it much more difficult for anyone to challenge your autonomy in the future. The evaluation he arranged took place that afternoon at a medical facility downtown. Dr. Sarah Martinez was a clinical psychologist who specialized in assessments of mental capacity for legal purposes. She spent 2 hours with me, administering cognitive tests, reviewing my medical history, and discussing my current living situation and future plans. At the end of our session, she gave me the kind of straightforward feedback I'd been hoping to hear. Mrs. Chen, you scored in the superior range on all measures of cognitive function. Your memory, reasoning ability, and judgment are all excellent for someone of any age, let alone someone in their 70s. You clearly have full capacity to make your own decisions about your finances, your living situation, and your medical care. I'll have a written report ready by tomorrow morning. That evening, I checked into a small hotel near the downtown area, using my own credit card, and reveling in the simple act of signing my own name on the registration form. I ordered room service for dinner, something I hadn't done in decades, and sat by the window looking out at the city lights while I ate. The food was overpriced and mediocre, but it tasted like freedom. I called David's house from the hotel phone, knowing that Jennifer would answer, and that she would be angry about my disappearance. I was right on both counts. "Mika, where are you?" she demanded as soon as she heard my voice. "Your note didn't say where you were going or when you'd be back. We've been worried sick." "I'm fine," I said calmly. "I'm visiting with some old friends and taking care of some personal business. I'll be in touch." "What old friends? What personal business?" "Mika, you can't just disappear like this without telling us where you are. What if something happens to you? What if you get confused and can't find your way back?" The concern in her voice might have fooled me a week earlier, but now I could hear the calculation behind it. She wasn't worried about my safety. She was worried about losing control of the narrative she'd been building about my incompetence. A confused, declining old woman didn't disappear on her own initiative and handle her own affairs independently. A confused old woman needed supervision and management, not the kind of autonomy I was demonstrating. "I'm not confused, Jennifer," I said. "I know exactly where I am and what I'm doing. I'll call again in a few days." I hung up before she could respond, and for the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking up to worry about whether I was becoming a burden to the people around me. I was becoming something else entirely, something I'd almost forgotten I could be. I was becoming myself again. The Senior Community Center on Pine Street became my unexpected sanctuary, though I had never imagined myself setting foot in such a place just weeks earlier. I discovered it by accident during one of my walks through downtown Spokane, drawn by the sound of laughter spilling from its open doors, and the sight of people my age moving with purpose rather than resignation. Unlike the sterile facilities Jennifer had probably researched for me, this place hummed with genuine activity and conversation that didn't revolve around medications or doctor appointments. I entered hesitantly that first Thursday morning, expecting to find the typical bingo games and craft circles that David had once suggested might be appropriate for someone my age. Instead, I walked into a bustling hub where people were debating local politics over coffee, organizing volunteer projects, planning travel adventures, and teaching each other everything from computer skills to ballroom dancing. The energy in the room was infectious, completely at odds with every assumption I'd internalized about what it meant to be in your 70s. Margaret Sullivan was the first person to approach me. A woman with silver hair cut in a stylish bob and wearing a sweater that was clearly expensive but not flashy. She had the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd spent her life making important decisions and wasn't about to stop now. "You look like someone who's trying to decide whether we're worth your time," she said with a smile that was both warm and challenging. "I'm Margaret, and I'm the unofficial welcoming committee around here. What brings you to our little corner of organized chaos?" I found myself telling her more than I'd intended about my situation, though I was careful not to reveal the full extent of what I'd discovered about David and Jennifer's plans. Margaret listened without the patronizing head tilts and sympathetic murmurs I'd grown accustomed to receiving when I tried to discuss my living arrangements with anyone. She asked intelligent questions and offered observations that showed she understood the complexity of family dynamics when aging parents were involved. "Family members often think they're being helpful when they're actually being controlling," she said matter-of-factly. "I see it all the time. Adult children who can't distinguish between genuine concern and their own anxiety about getting older. They start treating their parents like children because it makes them feel more secure about their own future, not because the parents actually need to be managed." Margaret had been a high school principal for 30 years before retiring, and she spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating complicated relationships and power dynamics. She was 71, lived alone in a downtown condominium, and had made it clear to her own adult children that she would ask for help when she needed it, but wouldn't tolerate being managed before that point arrived. "The key," she told me, "is setting boundaries before people start crossing them. Once you let someone convince you that you're not capable of making your own decisions, it's much harder to reclaim that authority." Through Margaret, I met others who had faced similar challenges with family members who'd grown too comfortable making decisions on their behalf. There was Harold Peterson, a retired accountant whose son had tried to convince him to sell his house and move into assisted living after Harold had a minor car accident. Harold had responded by taking a defensive driving course, having his vision checked, getting a complete physical exam, and presenting his son with documentation proving his continued competence behind the wheel. "I didn't argue with him," Harold explained. "I just gathered evidence that he was wrong and presented it like a business case. Hard to argue with facts when they're properly documented." Eleanor Martinez had dealt with a daughter who'd grown concerned about her mother's spending habits after Eleanor had made several large donations to charitable organizations. Instead of defending her choices, Eleanor had met with a financial planner, created a detailed budget that demonstrated her fiscal responsibility, and established formal procedures for her charitable giving that satisfied both her desire to be generous and her daughter's need for reassurance about her financial security. "The secret," Eleanor said, "is being proactive instead of reactive. When you control the narrative, other people have to respond to your facts instead of you having to defend against their assumptions." These conversations were revelatory because they introduced me to people who had refused to accept diminished expectations simply because they'd reached a certain age. They were dealing with the same challenges I faced with family members who confused love with control, but they'd found ways to maintain their autonomy without sacrificing their relationships entirely. They spoke about aging as something that required adaptation rather than surrender, adjustment rather than defeat. The center offered programs I'd never heard of, activities that had nothing to do with the passive entertainment I'd assumed was appropriate for people in their 70s. There were investment clubs where people shared strategies for managing their portfolios. There were travel groups that organized international trips for adventurous seniors. There were volunteer organizations that tackled serious community problems rather than just providing busy work for people who had nothing better to do. There were discussion groups that debated current events, book clubs that read challenging literature, and classes where people learned new skills instead of just maintaining old ones. I started attending regularly, initially just for the coffee and conversation, but gradually becoming involved in activities that engaged parts of my mind I'd almost forgotten existed. The legal advocacy group particularly interested me because they helped seniors navigate issues with healthcare, housing, and family conflicts. They dealt with people whose adult children were trying to gain control of their finances, whose landlords were trying to force them out of rent-controlled apartments, whose doctors were dismissing their concerns because of their age. The group was led by Patricia Wong, a retired family law attorney who volunteered her time to help seniors understand their legal rights and options. Patricia was my age but had maintained her law license and stayed current with regulations affecting older adults. She was sharp, direct, and completely unsentimental about the realities of aging in a society that often treated elderly people as problems to be managed, rather than individuals with continuing rights and preferences. The biggest mistake older adults make, Patricia told our group during one of her workshops, is assuming that their family members have their best interests at heart just because they're family. Adult children often have their own agendas, conscious or unconscious, that influence their recommendations about their parents' lives. They might be worried about their inheritance, or concerned about their own convenience, or dealing with their own anxiety about mortality. Those aren't necessarily bad motives, but they're not the same as genuinely prioritizing their parents' autonomy and happiness. Patricia's workshops taught practical strategies for protecting yourself from well-meaning but misguided family interference. She explained how to document your mental competency, how to structure your finances to prevent unauthorized access, how to create legal instruments that would protect your decision-making authority, even if your health declined in the future. She also taught us how to recognize the warning signs that someone was building a case for guardianship, knowledge that made me realize how far along David and Jennifer's plans had already progressed. Guardianship is supposed to be a last resort for people who truly cannot make their own decisions, Patricia explained. But it's increasingly being used as a tool for family members who want to control elderly relatives for financial or convenience reasons. Once someone gains guardianship over you, you lose the legal right to make decisions about where you live, how you spend your money, what medical treatments you receive, even who you're allowed to see. It's essentially a form of legal death that allows your body to keep breathing. The more I learned about the legal realities of aging, the more grateful I became that I'd overheard Jennifer's book club conversation before David and Jennifer could put their plans into action. Patricia confirmed that my strategy of gathering professional documentation of my competency was exactly the right approach, and she connected me with other resources that could help me build an even stronger case for my continued independence. Dr. Rebecca Kim was a geriatrician who specialized in comprehensive health assessments for older adults. Unlike the doctors I'd been seeing in Jennifer's network, Dr. Kim didn't assume that aging automatically meant declining function or increasing dependence. She conducted a thorough evaluation of my physical and cognitive health, looking for any legitimate concerns that might need to be addressed, but also documenting my strengths and capabilities. "Mrs. Chen, your health is excellent for someone of any age," Dr. Kim told me after completing her assessment. "Your blood pressure is well controlled, your cholesterol levels are good, your cognitive function is superior, and your physical fitness is better than many people decades younger. You have some minor arthritis and the mild hearing loss we've already addressed, but neither of those conditions affects your ability to live independently or make your own decisions." Dr. Kim's report became another piece of evidence in the file I was building to protect myself from David and Jennifer's guardianship plans. She also connected me with a comprehensive insurance review that revealed some interesting discrepancies in how my policies had been handled since I'd moved in with them. Several of my accounts had been changed to list David as the primary contact, and some of my medical information was being sent to Jennifer instead of directly to me. These weren't necessarily illegal changes, but they suggested a pattern of gradually assuming control over my affairs without my explicit consent. I also discovered that Jennifer had been in contact with my primary care physician's office, requesting information about my mental state and asking questions about my capacity to live independently. When I called the office directly, the nurse mentioned that my daughter-in-law had expressed concerns about my memory and decision-making abilities, concerns that had been noted in my file, even though they weren't based on any medical observations or formal assessments. "We want to make sure we're providing appropriate care," the nurse explained. "When family members reach out with concerns, we take those seriously and document them for the doctor's reference." I requested copies of my complete medical file and was disturbed to find several notes about family reports of confusion and daughter-in-law concerns about safety that bore no relationship to my actual health status or behavior during medical appointments. Jennifer had been systematically creating a paper trail that portrayed me as someone whose mental capacity was questionable, using my own medical records to build a case against my competency. This discovery led me to Patricia Wong's recommendation that I establish relationships with new healthcare providers who would assess my condition independently, without the influence of Jennifer's narrative about my declining abilities. The fresh evaluations I received painted a completely different picture of my health and mental status, one that would be difficult for any court to dismiss if David and Jennifer ever tried to proceed with guardianship proceedings. But perhaps the most significant change in my new world was the gradual shift in how I saw myself and my possibilities. For 5 years, I'd been living in an environment where my age was treated as a disability, where every choice I made was scrutinized for evidence of poor judgment, where my preferences were dismissed as symptoms of stubbornness or confusion. The senior center introduced me to people who saw aging as just another phase of life, one that brought challenges but also opportunities for growth, adventure, and contribution. I met people who had started new businesses in their 70s, gone back to school in their 80s, traveled to places they'd never seen, learned skills they'd never had time for during their working years, formed friendships that were deeper and more meaningful than relationships they'd maintained for decades. They had health issues, financial concerns, and family complications, but they approached these challenges as problems to be solved, rather than evidence that their useful lives were over. Margaret introduced me to her book club, which was nothing like Jennifer's group. They read serious literature, contemporary fiction, political biographies, and works by authors from cultures and backgrounds different from their own. They debated interpretations, challenged each other's perspectives, and used their reading as a way to continue learning about the world instead of just passing time with familiar entertainment. Reading keeps your mind flexible, Margaret explained. When you stop exposing yourself to new ideas and different viewpoints, that's when you really start getting old. Age is just a number, but intellectual stagnation is a choice. The book club met at different members' homes, and I was struck by how these people had created living spaces that reflected their personalities and interests rather than conforming to some expectation of how elderly people should live. Margaret's condo was filled with contemporary art and modern furniture. Harold's house displayed his collection of vintage cameras and photography equipment. Eleanor's apartment was a showcase for textiles and crafts from her travels around the world. None of them lived in spaces that had been child-proofed or simplified for their supposed limitations. None of them had given up cooking with sharp knives or drinking wine with dinner or staying up late when something interested them. They had adapted their environments to accommodate physical changes, but they hadn't surrendered their agency or their right to live according to their own preferences and values. I started spending entire days at the center, participating in activities that challenged me intellectually and socially. I joined the volunteer tax preparation program, using my background in legal and financial matters to help other seniors navigate complicated paperwork. I became involved in the center's advocacy efforts, helping to organize testimony for city council meetings about issues affecting older residents. I even signed up for a basic computer class, finally learning to use email and navigate the internet without having to ask anyone for help. Each new activity reinforced my growing sense that I had been living far below my potential for the past 5 years. I wasn't just capable of more than David and Jennifer had assumed. I was capable of more than I had assumed about myself. The limitations I'd accepted as inevitable consequences of aging were revealed to be mostly social constructions, expectations imposed by others rather than biological realities I had to accept. The transformation wasn't just intellectual or social. I felt physically different too, more energetic and alert than I had in years. I was walking more, sleeping better, eating meals that I chose, rather than meals that were chosen for me. I was engaging in conversations that stimulated my mind rather than just marking time until bedtime. I was making decisions about how to spend my time based on my own interests and values, rather than trying to avoid inconveniencing anyone else. Most importantly, I was remembering who I had been before I became someone's burden. I had been competent, decisive, and independent. I had managed complex responsibilities, solved difficult problems, and earned respect from colleagues and friends. Those capabilities hadn't disappeared when I turned 70, or when Frank died, or when I moved in with David and Jennifer. They had just been buried under layers of other people's assumptions about what I should and shouldn't be able to handle at my age. The new world I'd entered wasn't just a different place to spend my time. It was a different way of understanding what it meant to be 73 years old in 21st century America. It was a world where my experience was valued rather than dismissed, where my judgment was trusted rather than questioned, where my preferences mattered rather than being treated as obstacles to more efficient caregiving. And it was a world where I could begin planning not just how to escape from David and Jennifer's control, but how to build a future that would be worth living for whatever years I had remaining. The confrontation I'd been avoiding finally came on a rainy Tuesday evening in April, 3 weeks after I'd been staying at the hotel and building my new life piece by piece. David showed up at the senior center just as I was finishing a volunteer session, helping other seniors with their tax paperwork. I saw him through the window before he saw me, standing in the parking lot looking uncomfortable and out of place among the people my age, who were coming and going with obvious purpose and satisfaction. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, and there was something in his posture that suggested defeat rather than the righteous concern I'd expected. When he finally entered the building, his eyes searched the room until they found me sitting at a table with Eleanor Martinez, reviewing her charitable donation receipts for the year. The expression on his face was a mixture of relief, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment. "Mom," he said quietly, approaching our table with the careful steps of someone entering foreign territory. "I've been looking for you." Eleanor glanced between us and immediately understood that this was a private family matter. "I'll finish this at home, Mika," she said, gathering her papers with the efficient movements of someone who'd spent decades managing both professional and personal crises. "Call me if you need anything." She squeezed my shoulder as she passed David, a gesture of support that wasn't lost on either of us. David sat down across from me at the small table, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I could see him taking in the details of my appearance, noting that I looked healthier and more alert than I had in months, that I was dressed in clothes I'd bought for myself, rather than the shapeless garments Jennifer had insisted were more practical for someone my age. I could also see him processing the environment around us, the obvious competence and engagement of the people using the center, the sophisticated level of the activities taking place. "This isn't what I expected," he said finally, gesturing toward the room where people were engaged in everything from computer classes to investment planning sessions. "When you disappeared, Jennifer was convinced you were having some kind of breakdown. She said you'd been getting more confused lately, more unpredictable." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and worried about, and realized that somewhere along the way I'd stopped seeing him clearly. I'd been so focused on trying not to be a burden to his family that I'd forgotten he was also responsible for the person he'd become, the choices he'd made, the way he'd allowed his wife to treat me in their home. He wasn't just an innocent bystander being manipulated by Jennifer's concerns about my mental state. He was an active participant in the plan to take control of my life. "David," I said, keeping my voice calm and clear, "I know about the lawyer you've been consulting. I know about the guardianship papers you've been preparing. I know about the financial planning meetings you've been having to figure out how to gain control of my assets, while making me eligible for government assistance with facility costs." The color drained from his face, and I watched him struggle to find a response that wouldn't admit guilt, while also not adding insult to injury with outright lies. "Mom, it's not what you think. We were just trying to plan ahead, trying to make sure you'd be taken care of if something happened to you. If something happened to me, or when you decided something should happen to me." I asked, because from what I overheard, you weren't waiting for me to become incompetent. You were planning to have me declared incompetent whether I actually was or not. David's hands fidgeted with the edge of the table, and I could see him calculating how much I actually knew versus how much I might be guessing. "Jennifer was worried about your safety. She said you'd been doing dangerous things, forgetting things, getting confused about simple tasks." "What dangerous things, David? What specifically have I done that made either of you think I wasn't capable of taking care of myself?" He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, and I realized he couldn't actually cite any real incidents because there hadn't been any. Jennifer had been describing events that never happened, and he had either believed her lies or chosen to go along with them because they served his purposes. "The dish towel over the stove burner," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "That never happened. I never put a dish towel anywhere near a burner. Jennifer made that up. Just like she made up the story about me wandering around the house at night, giving Emma nightmares. Just like she made up whatever other incidents she used to convince you that I was becoming dangerous to myself and others. David stared at me, and I could see the moment when he realized that either his wife had been lying to him or he had been lying to himself about the real reasons for their guardianship plans. Either possibility meant confronting truths he clearly wasn't prepared to face. "Why are you here, David?" I asked. "Did you come to drag me back to your house so you could continue building your case against my competency? Did you come to convince me that I'm too confused to understand what's best for me? Or did you come because you're starting to realize that your plan was based on false premises?" "I came because you're my mother, and I was worried about you," he said, but there was no strength behind the words. "When you left that note and disappeared, I didn't know if you were safe, if you'd gotten lost, if something had happened to you. I left a note saying I was visiting friends and would call when I was settled. I did call. I told Jennifer I was fine and taking care of personal business. What part of that suggested I was lost or in danger? You didn't tell us where you were staying or when you'd be back. What if there had been an emergency? What if we'd needed to reach you?" "David, I'm 73 years old, not 7. I don't need permission to leave the house or approval for my travel plans. The fact that you think I do is exactly the problem I'm trying to solve." He was quiet for a long moment, looking around the room at the other seniors who were obviously managing their own lives quite successfully. "This place is different from what I expected," he said again. "Different from the places Jennifer was researching for me?" His silence was answer enough. "David, let me ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In the 5 years I've been living in your house, have I ever actually done anything that suggested I couldn't take care of myself? Have I ever gotten lost, forgotten to take my medications, left the stove on, done anything genuinely dangerous or concerning?" He considered the question longer than I expected, and I could see him searching his memory for real incidents rather than Jennifer's fabricated stories. "No," he said finally. "Not really." "Then why were you planning to have me declared incompetent? The lawyer said it was better to be proactive, to get things in place before there was a crisis. Whose idea was it to consult a lawyer in the first place? Jennifer thought we should understand our options. And whose idea was it to start documenting incidents of my supposed confusion? Jennifer said we needed to establish a pattern. David, do you understand that Jennifer has been systematically lying about my mental state in order to justify taking away my legal rights and controlling my finances?" He looked genuinely shocked by my direct statement, as if he'd never considered that his wife's concerns might be anything other than legitimate. "She wouldn't do that. She was just worried about you. She told her book club that I'd tried to cook with a dish towel over the burner. That never happened. She told her book club that I'd been wandering the house at night and giving Emma nightmares. That never happened either. She's been calling my doctor's office with reports of confusion and memory problems that don't exist. She's been creating a false narrative about my mental decline, and you've been helping her build a legal case based on lies." I could see him struggling with this information, trying to reconcile the wife he thought he knew with the evidence I was presenting. Maybe she misunderstood some things. Maybe she was just being overly cautious. "David, there's no misunderstanding involved when someone calls your mother's doctor to report non-existent symptoms of dementia. There's no caution involved when someone fabricates dangerous incidents that never occurred. That's deliberate deception designed to achieve a specific goal." "What goal?" "Control of my life and my assets. Jennifer wants me in a facility where someone else is responsible for my daily care, and she wants you to have legal authority over my finances. She's not trying to protect me from anything real. She's trying to eliminate my autonomy because my independence inconveniences her." David sat back in his chair as if I'd slapped him. "That's a terrible thing to say about Jennifer. She's been taking care of you for 5 years. Has she, David? Or have I been taking care of myself while living in her house and trying not to inconvenience her? When was the last time Jennifer actually helped me with something I couldn't do myself? When was the last time she showed any genuine interest in my well-being, rather than just managing my presence in her space?" He couldn't answer because the truth was that Jennifer had never taken care of me in any meaningful way. She had simply allowed me to exist in her house, while gradually building a case for why my existence there was becoming problematic and unsustainable. "I want you to meet some people," I said, standing up from the table. "I want you to see what this place actually is, and what the people here actually do." I introduced David to Margaret, who was leading a discussion group about local political issues. I showed him the tax preparation program, where volunteers with backgrounds in accounting and law helped other seniors navigate complex financial paperwork. I took him through the computer lab, where people in their 70s and 80s were learning to use social media and video calling to stay connected with distant family members. I introduced him to Harold, who was teaching a class on investment strategies for retirees, and to Eleanor, who was organizing a group trip to visit art museums in Seattle. "These people aren't patients or residents," I told him as we walked through the various program areas. "They're not being managed or supervised or cared for by someone else. They're living their own lives, making their own decisions, contributing to their community, learning new things, helping other people. This is what competent older adults look like when they're not being treated like children who need constant supervision." David watched the interactions around us with growing amazement. "I had no idea places like this existed," he said, "because Jennifer didn't want you to know about them. If you'd known that there were alternatives to the nursing home model she was pushing, you might have questioned whether institutional care was really necessary for me." We sat down in the center's library, surrounded by people reading, working on laptops, and engaged in quiet conversations. "David, I want you to understand something important. I'm not angry with you for being concerned about my future or for wanting to make sure I'll be taken care of as I get older. Those are reasonable concerns for any adult child to have. What I'm angry about is that you never talked to me about those concerns. You never asked me what I wanted or how I felt about my living situation, or what kind of future I was hoping for. You just accepted Jennifer's assessment of my declining capabilities and started making plans based on her recommendations. I thought we were doing what was best for you, based on whose definition of what was best. Did you ever ask me if I wanted to live in your house permanently? Did you ever ask me if I was happy with the arrangement? Did you ever ask me what I might prefer to do with my remaining years?" He was quiet, and I could see him realizing that they had indeed made assumptions about my preferences without ever actually consulting me about them. "David, I worked for over 40 years. I managed my own household, raised a family, handled complex responsibilities, made important decisions. When your father died, I managed his estate, settled his affairs, sold our house, and made careful plans for my financial security. I've never given you any reason to think I couldn't continue managing my own life, but you've been planning to take away my right to do that." The lawyer said that as people age, it becomes harder for them to make good decisions, even when they seem competent. He said families have a responsibility to step in before problems develop. "And did you ask the lawyer what evidence he had that my decision-making capacity was actually declining? Did you show him any medical evaluations or cognitive assessments that suggested I was becoming incompetent? Or did you just accept his general advice about what families should do, without any specific evidence that I needed intervention?" David's silence told me that they had proceeded with legal planning without any objective evidence of my incapacity. They had simply accepted the premise that my age made me vulnerable, and Jennifer's reports made me problematic. "I want to show you something," I said, pulling out the folder I'd been carrying with me. It contained copies of all the professional evaluations I'd undergone in the past few weeks. These are reports from a geriatrician, a clinical psychologist, and a neuropsychologist. They all confirm that my cognitive function, my judgment, and my capacity to make my own decisions are excellent. I scored in the superior range on every test they administered. David read through the reports with growing amazement. "These are all recent?" "All within the past month. I arranged for independent evaluations by professionals who had no connection to Jennifer's network of doctors and no preconceived notions about my mental state." "Why didn't you tell us you were having these evaluations done?" "Because I didn't trust you to be objective about the results. If these reports had shown any problems, I would have wanted to address them myself and make my own decisions about how to handle them. If they showed that I was competent, which they did, I wanted to have that documentation available in case you proceeded with guardianship filing. Quote. David looked at me with what appeared to be genuine surprise. You really thought we would try to have you declared incompetent against your will? David, you were consulting lawyers about guardianship while I was still living in your house, still managing my own daily activities, still demonstrating competence in every area of my life. What was I supposed to think? I guess I never really considered how that would feel from your perspective. That's exactly the problem. You never considered my perspective at all. You and Jennifer made decisions about my future based on what would be convenient for your family, not what would be best for me or what I might actually want. We sat quietly for a few minutes, watching the activity around us. People were coming and going with obvious purpose, engaged in conversations that suggested intellectual engagement rather than just social pleasantries. The energy in the room was completely different from the subdued atmosphere of the assisted living facilities I was sure Jennifer had toured. What do you want, Mom? David asked finally. What would make you happy? It was the first time in 5 years that anyone had asked me that question, and I found myself momentarily speechless. I had spent so long focused on not being a burden that I had almost forgotten I was allowed to have preferences about my own life. I want to live independently, I said. I want to make my own decisions about where I live, how I spend my money, what medical care I receive, how I spend my time. I want to be treated like a competent adult, rather than a problem to be managed. I want to have relationships with my family that are based on mutual respect rather than one-sided caretaking that I never actually needed. Do you want to move back home with us? No, David. I want to find my own place and live my own life. I want to maintain a relationship with you and your family. But I want it to be a relationship between equals, not between caregivers, and someone who needs to be cared for. Jennifer's going to be upset about this. She's been really worried about you. Jennifer's going to be upset because this disrupts her narrative about my declining capabilities. She's invested a lot of time and effort in building a case for why I needed to be controlled and managed. My independence threatens that investment. That's not fair. Jennifer does care about you. David, caring about someone and respecting them are two different things. Jennifer may care about my safety and my health, but she doesn't respect my right to make my own decisions about my life. She's more concerned about controlling the risk of something happening to me than she is about preserving my autonomy and dignity. So what happens now? Now I find my own place to live, and we figure out how to have a relationship that doesn't require me to surrender my independence in exchange for your family's acceptance. And if we can't figure that out, then we don't have a relationship, David. I'd rather be alone and respected than surrounded by people who think I'm too incompetent to manage my own life. David looked shocked by my directness, but I could also see something like relief in his expression, as if I'd finally given him permission to stop carrying responsibility for decisions I was perfectly capable of making myself. I need to think about all this, he said. Take all the time you need. But David, I want you to understand something clearly. I'm not asking for your permission to live independently. And I'm not negotiating about whether I'm competent to make my own decisions. Those things are established facts supported by professional documentation. What I'm offering you is the opportunity to maintain a relationship with me based on respect for my autonomy. If you're not interested in that kind of relationship, that's your choice, but it won't change my plans for my own life. After David left that evening, I sat alone in the center's library, feeling emotionally drained but also strangely liberated. For the first time in 5 years, I had spoken my truth directly to my son without worrying about his reaction or trying to soften the impact of my words. I had stated my boundaries clearly and offered him a choice about how to respond to them. I had also finally acknowledged to myself that I was prepared to lose the relationship with my family, if that's what it took to preserve my dignity and autonomy. The realization was both terrifying and empowering. I loved David and wanted to continue being part of his children's lives, but I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own well-being for the comfort of maintaining family connections that diminished rather than enhanced my life. Margaret found me there an hour later, still processing the conversation with David and what it might mean for my future. "How did it go?" she asked, settling into the chair beside me. I told him the truth about everything. About what I'd overheard, about the evaluations I'd had done, about what I want for my life going forward. How did he take it? Like someone who's never really considered that his mother might have opinions about her own future. I think I may have shocked him into actually thinking about my perspective for the first time in years. That's progress, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. Margaret, can I ask you something? When you decided to maintain your independence after your husband died, were you ever afraid that your children would reject you for not being the kind of mother they expected you to be? Terrified, she said without hesitation. But I realized that being afraid of their rejection was keeping me from living authentically. I decided I'd rather have honest relationships with them based on who I actually am than comfortable relationships based on who they wanted me to be. And how did that work out? It took about 2 years, but we're closer now than we've ever been. Turns out that when you stop trying to manage other people's emotions and expectations, they have to learn to deal with you as a real person instead of a projection of their own fears and assumptions. I think I just offered David that choice. Good for you. And regardless of how he responds, you'll know that you honored yourself by being honest about what you need and want. That night, back in my hotel room, I called Patricia Wong and told her about my conversation with David. She listened carefully to my account of what he'd said about their legal consultations and financial planning meetings. Mika, I think you should know that based on what you've told me, you may want to consider filing a protective order to prevent them from proceeding with any guardianship action, she said. The fact that they were building a case based on fabricated incidents could be considered a form of elder abuse. I don't want to pursue legal action against my own family unless it becomes absolutely necessary. I understand, but I want you to know that option exists if they continue to pursue guardianship despite the evidence of your competency. Sometimes the threat of exposure is enough to make people reconsider their plans. What would happen if they did file guardianship papers? With the documentation you've gathered, any competent judge would dismiss their petition immediately. But defending yourself would still require time, money, and emotional energy that you shouldn't have to spend. It's better to prevent the filing altogether if possible. After we hung up, I realized that I had moved far beyond simply escaping from David and Jennifer's control. I had built a comprehensive case for my own competency, established a support network of people who respected my autonomy, and developed the confidence to advocate for myself in ways I'd never imagined would be necessary. The transformation wasn't just external. Something fundamental had shifted in how I saw myself and my place in the world. I was no longer the diminished, careful version of myself that had emerged during my years in David's house. I was someone who commanded respect, made important decisions, and refused to accept limitations that weren't based on actual incapacity. I was finally becoming the person I'd been before I allowed other people's assumptions about aging to define my reality. And that person was someone I was proud to be. The apartment I found was nothing like the places Jennifer had researched for me, and everything like the home I'd dreamed of during those long nights in her guest room. It was a one-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a converted brick building in downtown Spokane, with tall windows that filled the space with natural light and a small balcony overlooking the river. The kitchen was compact but functional, with enough counter space for me to cook real meals again. The living room was large enough for a proper reading chair and bookshelves, luxuries I hadn't enjoyed in 5 years. I signed the lease on a Thursday morning in May, using my own checkbook and my own signature, savoring the simple act of making a housing decision without consulting anyone else. The landlord, a woman about my age named Carol, treated me like any other tenant, asking about my rental history and income, but never questioning whether someone my age should be living alone or suggesting that I might need special accommodations for elderly residents. The building is quiet but not isolated, Carol explained, as she showed me around the unit. We have several residents your age who've chosen to downsize from houses they didn't want to maintain anymore. There's a good community here, but everyone respects each other's privacy. Moving day was an adventure I orchestrated entirely myself. I hired professional movers, coordinated the utilities, transfers, and even bought new furniture to replace the pieces I'd left behind at David's house. The freedom to choose my own sofa, my own dishes, my own artwork, felt almost intoxicating after years of living in spaces designed by someone else's aesthetic preferences. Margaret and Eleanor helped me unpack, but their assistance was offered rather than imposed, and they treated my decorating decisions as expressions of personal taste rather than potential safety hazards. When I hung a mirror above the fireplace mantel, no one worried that I might hurt myself using a hammer. When I arranged my books on the high shelves, no one suggested that climbing a stepladder was too dangerous for someone my age. "This feels like you," Margaret said as we stood in my living room admiring the afternoon light streaming through the windows. "It's sophisticated but comfortable, organized but not sterile. It's the first place that's been mine since Frank died," I said. I'd forgotten how good it feels to be surrounded by things I chose myself. The senior center became my professional headquarters as well as my social hub. Patricia Wong connected me with opportunities to use my legal background in volunteer advocacy work, helping other seniors navigate complex bureaucracies and protect themselves from financial exploitation. Harold recruited me for the center's financial literacy program, where I taught workshops on estate planning and asset protection. I discovered that my experience with David and Jennifer's guardianship scheme had given me valuable insight into the tactics used by adult children who want to gain control over their parents' lives and resources. I became something of an expert on recognizing the early warning signs of financial abuse disguised as caregiving, and I developed presentations that helped other seniors protect themselves from well-meaning but misguided family interference. "The key is maintaining your paper trail," I would tell audiences at my workshops. "Keep your own copies of all financial documents, medical records, and legal papers. Don't let anyone else become the sole contact person for your accounts or your healthcare providers. Make sure you have independent relationships with professionals who can attest to your competency if it's ever questioned." My relationship with David and Jennifer evolved slowly and unevenly over the months following my move. David visited my apartment twice, both times looking genuinely surprised by how well I was managing on my own. He seemed to be processing a fundamental shift in how he understood my capabilities and needs, though he was careful not to criticize Jennifer's earlier assessments directly. "Mom, I have to admit I was wrong about a lot of things," he said during his second visit, sitting in my kitchen while I prepared coffee for both of us. "This place is great, and you seem happier than you've been in years." "I am happier," I said simply. "I'm living according to my own choices rather than trying to fit into someone else's idea of what my life should look like." "Jennifer is having a harder time with the adjustment. She feels like you rejected her help and her concern for your welfare." "David, Jennifer's concern was never about my welfare. It was about controlling the inconvenience my presence created in her life. There's a difference between helping someone and managing them, and she never learned to distinguish between the two." Jennifer herself remained distant and somewhat hostile, though she was careful to express her disapproval in subtle ways that couldn't be directly challenged. When David brought the children to visit my apartment, Jennifer came along but spent the entire time making observations about how difficult it must be for me to manage stairs, how isolated I must feel without family nearby, how expensive downtown living must be for someone on a fixed income. "I worry about you being alone so much," she said, standing in my living room and looking around with the expression of someone inspecting a crime scene. "What if something happens to you and no one knows about it for days?" "Jennifer, I'm part of a community now. I have friends who check on me, activities I attend regularly, responsibilities that people count on me to fulfill. I'm much less isolated here than I was living in your house. But what if you fall, or have a medical emergency, or get confused about something important? Then I'll handle it the same way any other competent adult would. I'll call for help if I need it, seek medical attention if required, and ask for assistance with things I can't manage myself. The difference is that I'll make those decisions based on actual circumstances, rather than having someone else make them based on theoretical risks." Emma and Marcus, now 13 and 15, seemed more comfortable with me in my own space than they had been when I lived in their house. Without Jennifer's subtle signals to keep their interactions brief and superficial, they were able to engage with me as an interesting person, rather than an obligation they needed to fulfill. Emma was fascinated by my volunteer work and asked detailed questions about the legal issues I helped other seniors resolve. "Grandma Mika, do people really try to steal money from their own parents?" she asked during one visit. "Sometimes they do, Emma, though they usually convince themselves they're protecting their parents rather than taking advantage of them. That's why it's important for people to maintain their independence as long as they're able to, and why it's important for families to respect that independence even when it makes them anxious. Quote. Marcus, who was taking a civics class at school, wanted to understand how guardianship laws worked and why they might be misused. So someone could basically take away your right to make your own decisions just by convincing a judge that you're not smart enough anymore? That's exactly right, Marcus. And once someone has guardianship over you, you lose the legal right to challenge their decisions about your life. It's supposed to be reserved for people who truly can't take care of themselves, but it's sometimes used against people who are just inconvenient for their families to deal with. These conversations with my grandchildren were among the most satisfying aspects of my new life. They were treating me like an expert with valuable knowledge to share rather than like an elderly relative they needed to humor with polite attention. They were learning about complex issues by engaging with my real-world experience, and I was sharing knowledge that might help them understand and navigate their own family relationships as they got older. My daily routines became sources of pleasure, rather than just ways to fill time until something more interesting happened. I walked to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, choosing fresh vegetables and talking with vendors who came to recognize me as a regular customer. I attended evening lectures at the community college, audit classes in subjects that had always interested me but that I'd never had time to explore during my working years. I joined a book club that met at the downtown library, different from Margaret's group but equally engaging. We read contemporary fiction, memoirs by women who'd made interesting life choices, historical accounts of social movements that had shaped the world I'd lived through. The discussions were intellectually challenging and personally meaningful, conversations that connected literature to real-world experiences in ways that enriched both. Reading helps me understand that my story isn't unusual, I told Eleanor one afternoon as we walked along the river path near my apartment. There are millions of women who've had to reclaim their autonomy after other people decided they were too old or too fragile to manage their own lives. And now you're helping other women do the same thing. It feels like the most important work I've ever done. When I was a legal secretary, I was helping other people solve their problems. Now I'm helping people avoid the problem I almost let destroy my life. The workshops and presentations I gave at the Senior Center attracted increasing attention from social workers, elder law attorneys, and healthcare providers who wanted to understand how families could better support aging relatives without undermining their independence. I was invited to speak at conferences, to contribute to articles about elder rights, to consult with organizations that provided services to older adults. Mika has become one of our most effective advocates, Patricia, Wong told a reporter who was writing about innovative approaches to senior services. She speaks from personal experience about the difference between supportive families and controlling families, and she helps people understand that autonomy and safety aren't mutually exclusive goals. My financial situation, which Jennifer had implied was precarious and needed family oversight, proved to be quite stable once I was managing it independently again. I had enough saved to live comfortably for the rest of my life, enough to afford the apartment I wanted and the activities I enjoyed, enough to be generous with charitable causes that mattered to me. The money David and Jennifer had been planning to control was funding a life that was richer and more purposeful than anything I could have imagined when I was living in their house. The legal documentation I'd gathered to protect myself from their guardianship plans became the foundation for a comprehensive estate plan that ensured my assets would be distributed according to my wishes, rather than someone else's assumptions about what I would have wanted. I established healthcare directives that specified exactly what kinds of medical interventions I would and wouldn't accept, and under what circumstances I might want someone else to make healthcare decisions for me. The goal is to make your own choices while you're fully capable, so that if you ever do become incapacitated, your previous decisions guide what happens rather than leaving those choices to other people. My attorney explained as we reviewed the documents. Most importantly, I created a support network that was based on mutual respect, rather than one-sided dependency. Margaret and I became genuine friends who enjoyed each other's company and shared similar values about aging with dignity and purpose. Eleanor and I traveled together, taking weekend trips to cities we'd never visited and planning a longer journey to Europe for the following year. Harold and I collaborated on financial workshops that combined his expertise in investment strategies with my knowledge of legal protections. These relationships were different from the family connections I'd been trying to preserve with David and Jennifer. They were chosen rather than obligated, based on shared interests rather than shared history, maintained through mutual enjoyment rather than duty or guilt. They provided emotional support and practical assistance when needed, but they didn't require me to surrender my autonomy in exchange for acceptance. On a crisp October evening, almost 6 months after I'd moved into my apartment, I stood on my balcony, looking out at the lights reflecting on the river, and realized that I was no longer afraid of the future. For 5 years, I had lived in constant anxiety about becoming more of a burden, more of a problem, more of an inconvenience to the people around me. I had tried to make myself smaller and quieter and more manageable, hoping that if I needed less, people would resent me less. But making myself smaller had only made me more vulnerable to other people's assumptions and manipulations. The independence I had fought to reclaim wasn't just about living alone or making my own decisions. It was about insisting that my life had continuing value and meaning, that my preferences and choices mattered, that I deserved respect and consideration regardless of my age or the inconvenience my autonomy might create for others. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard at Jennifer's book club, the casual way she'd discussed having me declared incompetent and placed in institutional care, the laughter in her voice when she'd described building a case against my mental capacity. I thought about how close I'd come to accepting their assessment of my declining capabilities, how nearly I'd surrendered my agency to people who saw my independence as a problem to be solved rather than a right to be protected. The woman who had listened to those conversations in helpless silence was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect and refused to accept limitations that weren't based on actual incapacity. The transformation wasn't just about changing my living situation or my daily activities. It was about reclaiming my identity as a competent, valuable person whose life was worth living on her own terms. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at my reflection in the youthful bathroom mirror and saw someone I was proud to be. My hair was silver, my face was lined, my body showed the effects of 7 decades of living, but my eyes were clear and determined. I was still Mika Chen, still capable of learning and growing and contributing, still deserving of dignity and autonomy and respect. I had spent 5 years being invisible in my own life, allowing other people to define my limitations and plan my future. But invisibility, I'd learned, was a choice, not an inevitable consequence of aging. I was visible now, present in my own life, actively engaged in creating the future I wanted, rather than passively accepting the future other people thought I should have. And for the first time in years, that future felt full of possibilities rather than restrictions, opportunities rather than losses, adventures rather than mere survival. I was 73 years old, and my life was just beginning again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.